All right, welcome back to Odyssey of a Teenage Dirtbag, the true story of how a kid who once had nothing, no direction, and no shot built a life worth living. If you're new here, I'm glad you found us. This is a podcast about what it really takes to climb out from rock bottom and why it's always possible. So let's get into it. This is episode 2, Teenage Wasteland. The days and years started to slow down for me just as I'd entered high school. I'd developed some aptitude for skateboarding, and most of my days were spent winding down at the local grocery store parking lots, attempting to grind a handrail or kickflip down a set of stairs. My friend Carmen's dad had built him a half pipe in his backyard, and so I would waste away my days scraping elbows and bruising knees over there for a while, but I started venturing down to the nearby parking lots until security guards would chase me away each day. It was really the first time in my life that I accepted the necessity of rebellion in achieving my personal goals. I wanted to be a professional skateboarder at the time, like Chad Muska or Tony Hawk, and those damn grocery stores and banks just refused to let me develop my skills. They would put up signs and set out security guards and call the cops, and I would learn each time how to better avoid them. And in a way, this was my first real exposure to the routine breaking of rules. And each time I did it, breaking the rules later down the road was a much easier experience. I'd learned that some rules were dumb and to just decide for myself which ones they were. And so it wasn't long before my summer nights included more significant rule breaking. I was working at Baskin & Robbins, scooping ice cream for extra money. I was 15 at the time, and my parents had a vacation planned out in eastern Washington at Banks Lake. But I'd convinced them to leave me behind because I was working. And during their 3-day absence, I had planned out an exceptional house party with all of my skateboarding buddies. The truth is, though, we were freshmen in high school, and so we weren't particularly socially connected at that time. So despite having obtained a few cases of beer and having a safe place to drink, we only managed to get about 8 people to come over to our party. But it was the first time I'd experienced the sensation of being drunk. And it was like a total release for me. I remember running down the street in pure bliss, enjoying the air on my naked body while all of my friends chased behind yelling, "Mike, are you fucking serious?" But it was fun. It was a fun time. And I found the experience to be exceptional and foundational enough for me to want to do it again at the nearest opportunity. And that same year, I had my first real girlfriend. I say real girlfriend because while I'd had 2 girlfriends before Tanya, Audrey and Heather, they don't really count. Heather and I dated when I was in the 8th grade, and I was quite honestly obsessed with her. She was my crush that entire year. My mom wouldn't let me have a girlfriend until I was 16, though. And so Heather very much was a secret love. We didn't have cell phones, again, landlines and whatnot. And so whenever I called her landline, her dad would answer first. And so most of the time I would just hang up. But occasionally we would talk. But I do remember Heather was the first girl that I would just lay awake at night and pray to God, saying, "Please, God, let me just please marry Heather. Please, I will do anything if she can be my girlfriend forever." And I was even named a video game character in one of the Final Fantasy games I was playing at the time after her. And so each time I would play the game, her name would come up as one of the characters on my party. So I was obsessed. And ultimately, my brother ratted me out to my mom that I had a girlfriend before I was 16 and allowed to. And so she made me break up with her. I still tried to keep it going for a few months, but after a while, she just broke up with me anyway. So we had never kissed, and that's sort of my minimum criteria for being an official girlfriend. So again, Heather doesn't really count. But Tanya was a real girlfriend. I think it was the first time I experienced love in that sweet and very youthful kind of way, where you're just completely overtaken. I was totally captured by my adolescent love for her. I would walk to the grocery store each day and use the money I'd earned at my job at Baskin & Robbins to buy a Sprite remix and a pack of Starburst candy to bring to school the next day for her. And we would cuddle and kiss sweetly on the couch after school. But I wasn't brave enough to make out with her. I was always like afraid of being a bad kisser since, I don't know, 90s movies and television had sufficiently convinced me that being a good kisser was a significant priority for women at the time. And so I was afraid of swinging and missing. But Tanya didn't seem to mind and was just as affectionate back. And we ultimately broke up because some friends of hers who rode my bus had told me that she was grinding with other boys at one of the high school dances that I couldn't go to. And she denied the rumors vehemently and broke up with me for being jealous. So it's all fair. But I was crushed at the time, and that was my first lesson in jealousy and love. She tried to rekindle our connection later that summer, but by that time I had sort of moved on. And, that's how young love is. I was already a poor student before I got to high school. I'd spent the years leading up cheating on math assignments by using the answers in the back of the book every single time. So naturally, being the pretty bright kid that I was, I could bullshit my way to a C with about any assignment or test if it allowed for any measure of subjective inputs. So I'd been coasting and learning nothing for a really long time, attending classes for friendships and being forced to take summer school each summer to catch up on any lost credits. There were times in summer school when I would get accused of cheating because my work product was more sophisticated than my peers. I remember one time a teacher pulled me aside and asked me what all the big words meant in my essay, like adamantine. And she was trying to catch me ripping off, someone else's work, but I knew all the big words. And then she later, bragged to another colleague about my writing once she was convinced that I actually had written it. And so I was proud of those kind of small moments like that, but it still only allowed me to pay attention as much as I had to. I still lived my life from one crush at a time at that time. And so each motivating crush helped me to work harder to earn money for, dates or new clothes. And each crush inspiring me to reinvent myself in any newfound way that I thought would be they would finally deem, trying to reinvent myself in any newfound way that I thought would finally deem me to be worthy of the word cool, which was very important to me for most of my teenage years. But I had the good fortune of being a teenage boy during the release and popular rise of the Fast and the Furious movies. And specifically, the first and second movies were really popular. And so out of this collective teenage zeitgeist came video games like Need for Speed Underground 1 and 2, and the rise of highly modified cars and car meets. And so even before the early 2000s tuner culture, I had been fascinated with cars. My grandfather worked on and raced cars, and throughout most of my childhood, he routinely drove me around at high speeds on back roads, slamming gears, burning rubber. He purchased for us grandkids a go-kart early on, so I was used to driving at a very young age. I remember being as young as maybe 10 and taking his Nissan Pulsar 5-speed to the mailbox a mile away and back, and so I was comfortable behind the wheel at a young age. My grandpa had loved NASCAR, and he had encouraged me to take time to appreciate all things motorsports. So really, by the time I was 16, I don't think I cared about anything more than cars, except for maybe girls. My first car was a brown Subaru Legacy, but to me, it might as well have been a Ferrari. My good friend Tony and I would work on that car for hours, making modifications to the engine and lighting to try to compete with other guys at the local car meets. We would drive to nearby parking lots to meet with, 30 or 40 other cars to all pop hoods and talk shop. It's where I would smoke cigarettes for the first time and where I would watch my first fist fight. We would set up races and use a little police scanner to listen for incoming cops. And it really felt like life in the movies. It was an exciting time to be a teenager. Races were held on Fridays and Saturdays with dangerous chases, high stakes bets and criminal activity all around. I felt like an outlaw and I liked it. Now, around this time, the Seattle music scene was on fire. I was driving up every chance I could get to go to local shows at a small concert venue called Wasteland to see bands like Schoolyard Heroes or Emery. The concert venue has since undergone a series of name changes, and now it's called El Corazon. But to me, it will always be Graceland. And if a show was in Seattle, I would go up to Graceland. And if it was in Tacoma, I would go to Hell's Kitchen off 6th Avenue. And I went just about every chance I could get. It was just a seriously fun time to be alive and to be moving through adolescence. My brother and I would pick up our neighbor Jason and our other neighbor Molly, and we'd just escape to concerts, stage diving or moshing or, just rocking out and then do it all again the next weekend. The scene kid movement was on the rise, and due to the compelling influences of my cute neighbor Molly, who in all wisdom convinced me that scene kids were the hottest things since fire, I thought I should also join the revolution. MySpace was just starting to become a thing, and so suddenly I had one and dyed my hair black and wore eyeliner and sang sad songs with the best of them. I started dating a girl named Lauren, who was a cheerleader at my high school's rival, Enumclaw High School, and she was flirty and fun, but she liked to flirt with everyone. So it was just one of those relationships that was hot and cold. But we were really serious for a while. She was who I'd lost my virginity to. But things fell apart at prom when she left with another guy. And prom was in Seattle at one of those Argosy cruise boats. And so afterwards, I'd spent my time walking from the dock, searching for friends to catch a ride home with. And it was really my first true and genuine heartbreak. I remember feeling like my entire world was over. We'd given each other promise rings. And so to me at 16, it felt like I was going through a divorce. I'd stopped going to school altogether for a couple of weeks, and I pretended like I didn't care if I lived or died. When my mom finally forced me to go back to school, I would just skip class and go drive off with friends to avoid, any real responsibility. We would all go to my friend Joey's house and get his parents' guns from their safe and then go target shooting on the Forest Service roads above Wilkeson. And then they would drop me off back at school just before the bell rang for the day. So it was, it was fun. And I remember it was a few weeks into the breakup with Lauren when I was sitting around my friend Jordan's music room with a group of friends. And Jordan had sort of an assortment of drums and guitars in this felt-lined room with soundproofing where we would sat crisscrossed in a circle on the floor, and they were all smoking a bowl of weed, and I'd been around before when they were all smoking, but I'd always passed on it. For years, my friends had smoked weed, but I'd never partook, and my friends were always surprised when I said that I didn't smoke weed, and so it sort of became this badge of honor, being one of the last in the friend group to not do it. But I didn't really care anymore, and after my breakup, and so I used my sad mood to give me an excuse to push me forward. And I don't really remember feeling particularly anything that first time, but it was enough to break the ice, so to speak, and make me want to try it again. The next time it worked. That time, that was an experience. I was at my friend Jake's house, and we'd smoked out of a homemade bong we'd made out of a 2-liter soda bottle and some tinfoil. And his younger sister at one point came into the bathroom when we were cutting up the 2-liter bottle to make the bong. And we'd lied to her, telling her that we were making a submarine to dive and sink in the bathtub, and once we'd finally got all the parts together and got it working, we smoked some weed, and it was some that we had gotten from our other friend Nick's dad. And after a few puffs, I was laughing hysterically, and we were just totally engaged in a state of play. The neighborhood was our playground that night, and we just wandered around laughing and exploring the world through this new lens. We went back home and I slept it off. And for the first time, I felt like I had experienced something truly spectacular. Like, drinking was fine, sure, but this was on another level. It was uplifting and jovial, and I just had fun. And, I had been through years and years of dare campaigns telling me, just say no. So I was feeling like, what the fuck did they know? Something had been cracked open for me. And something changed in my mind, and I was just ready to call bullshit on any other lie that I'd been told after that. So later that year, I started dating a girl named Bree, and I was probably as enamored with her as anyone I'd ever met up to that point. Bree was one of the more spectacular girls that I'd dated in just a sincere and beautiful kind of way. We'd had a few classes together, and she was kind to me during my breakup with Lauren. And honestly, I don't know how I really ever caught her interest in me at all, but I had it. And we shared a passion for good music, and we would drive around listening to albums and enjoying each other's company. And around the same time, my peer group was growing, and I was becoming more popular. Historically, I'd been an outsider skater kid, but by my junior year in high school, I was getting invited to more parties by kids who were way cooler than me on the social Richter scale. And then I'd become a bit fixated at the idea of just looking cool and doing cool things. And anything that I thought advanced that image, I was all for. One of my newer friends, Nick, was connected to a larger group of people I thought were particularly cool. And he and my other friend Jake were inviting me to more drinking nights and smoke outs, and I was feeling included and a part of their little group. And I felt like I was moving closer towards being in, with the cool kids. And these two knuckleheads had convinced me to break up with Bree. They had told me that she was bringing me down and that she was a nag and that they knew way hotter girls that were routinely asking about me. And that she wasn't even good looking, and she, a number of other reasons why I needed to break up with her. And I was an idiot, and I listened to them. And now I truly believe that we all grow most from our mistakes. And really, you only learn when you screw it up. That's the only time you really truly learn, is when you get it wrong. And so I don't regret breaking up with Bree, but I do regret how I broke up with Bree. I told the other guys in our friend group that I didn't really like her and that she'd given or gave bad blowjobs. It was just such an unnecessary and cruel statement that wasn't even true or relevant. But I thought I was being cool in the moment by sounding sexually sophisticated or like I knew the difference between a good or a bad blowjob. And one of my friends told Bree what I had said, and I'm certain it just humiliated her. After a few weeks, I'd found out that Nick and Jake had really only convinced me to break up with her so that Nick could take a shot at dating her, and that they didn't give a shit about being my friend at all. And so I was a complete fool, and I really felt it in fullness. She didn't deserve the embarrassment that I gave her. She didn't deserve any of it. And it was a hard mistake for me. But after the fiasco with Bree, I started living life a little closer to the edge. I'd been routinely racing cars with Tony. I was smoking weed whenever it was available to me at the time, and I was going to house parties whenever I was invited. But even in the worst moments of my life, I've always had a solid work ethic. From the time I could hold an axe, I was splitting wood for extra money at my grandpa's house. And so by the time I was 15, I had two jobs. One was working as a landscaper for my friend's older brother, Jake, and the other was working at Baskin & Robbins scooping ice cream. I was unfortunately fired from my Baskin & Robbins job after donning plastic cups as armor and using cake spatulas as swords to have a frosting battle with a colleague of mine. We had cleaned up the walls, but forgot to look up. And so the owner was very pissed off when he saw the frosting splatters all over the ceiling, like something akin to a Sistine Chapel painting by Nickelodeon. I never really made much money at that place anyways, because they allowed us to take out an ice cream tab on our paycheck, and I pretty much ran that thing up every week buying pints of ice cream. So, say la vie to that job, but I learned an important lesson at that job. Not everyone has a sense of humor. And so I wasn't overly dismayed when I had to look for new work. Growing up poor had made me resourceful, and it wasn't long before I'd figured out ways to earn extra money. Initially, I'd taken a job at Wendy's, working the grill, but it wasn't really covering the costs of gas and food and weed with just after school hours. And so my friend Casey and I developed a pretty good little scheme for earning extra cash between paychecks. We would go to Walmart and load up a shopping cart with all sorts of random goods. And then we would go to the DVD section of the store and load up the cart with about 20 or 30 of the newest release movies. And with our shopping cart full, we would then go about 3 aisles over to the toy section where, the really cheap toys were, like the rubber snakes and whoopee cushions and dinosaurs that grow in water, and they didn't have any security cameras in that aisle. And so Casey would stuff all of the DVDs into his XXL Hot Topic pants, the kind that the goth kids wore. I would then continue out of that section with the shopping cart, meandering the store while Casey went into the bathroom with a pair of scissors, and he would crack open all of the DVDs in the bathroom and remove all of the small little metal sensors that would otherwise beep if you tried to, leave through the doors without paying. And so once all the sensors were removed, Casey would put the DVDs back in his pants and walk out of the store. I would then abandon the cart and leave the store through the other door. And once we had all of the DVDs out of the store, we would just go up the road to GameStop and sell them for cash. When we pulled this scheme for a while, it was a pretty good little scheme when we never got caught, but eventually GameStop got wise and stopped buying our DVDs. And so, after shoplifting for a bit, I had decided there was probably lower risk ways to make an extra buck. After all, I spent most of my extra money on weed, so why shouldn't I just supply myself? And I thought, I might as well supply everyone else in the area while I was at it. So, the first ounce of weed I bought was from a big Samoan guy who would end up being my source for a little while. We'd meet at a Fred Meyer parking lot, and I would, have my trunk already popped open before he'd arrived, and he would just get out really quickly and put the weed in my trunk and then sit in the passenger seat and grab some cash from me and count it out. And leave. And, it cost $280 an ounce for his weed at the time. And for the first few ounces, I really made no money, absent having just a few extra bowls to smoke and some gas money. The weed was high quality, but, too expensive, and nobody wanted to buy a 1.5 gram dub sack. And so later I found another guy who sold me an ounce of really swaggy, shitty weed, but it was $180. And black market prices were about $10 a gram, with 28 grams in an ounce. And so I figured that if I sold an ounce or so a day, I could make about $100 or so bucks a day. And that was pretty good money for me at the time. I would package my weed with little paper fortunes, like little fortune cookies, to try and gain some notoriety. But really, it was all just fun for me. Living on the edge of the law had become pretty routine at this stage of my life. And I would spend most of my days going to school for a few periods, skipping class after lunch, selling weed to my friends in and out of class, and then going to the skate park after school and selling more weed, and then going to the parking lot at night to race cars and sell more weed. I wasn't flushed with cash, but I always had money for gas and a good time. And at 17 years old, that's really all you need to get in a lot of trouble. My friends and I were all just pushing our limits. We would start fights. We would steal from the store, run from the cops, race cars, and then do it all over again. And I remember the first time I got arrested, I was at this party in Puyallup. I had been drinking first at a bonfire way up in Eatonville with some friends, and then we'd all gotten invited to my friend Zach's apartment and closer to downtown. I was drunk before I'd even left the bonfire, as I was drinking Red Dogs, I think, and I'd even tooted some cocaine that a friend had brought along. And I hadn't done cocaine before, but I was drunk, and he offered, and so, when in Rome. And before I knew it, I was riding in the back seat of my own car down to another party across town. And I remember just having a great time, blasting the stereo, the whole drive down. I was making out with a girl I just met in the back seat. And then suddenly we were there at Zach's house. I went into his back bedroom with the girl from earlier when suddenly this loud dun, dun, knocking came from the door with this announcement that it was the police. And at this point, anyone who knew anything about partying knew never open the door to cops at a party. You turn the damn music off, you turn the lights off, you let them knock on the door all night if they want to, but never open the door. But this night of all nights, someone opened the door and the cops burst in. And I was on the second floor of the apartment. And I remember at the time thinking, God, jump off the balcony, dude. But I hesitated, thinking maybe the cops would just be nice and let us all go. So I stayed put after all. And my hopes were dashed when Johnny Law rounded us all up and made us form a line to start breathalyzing us sort of one by one. And I blew way over the limit, and they threw me in the back of a paddy wagon with the rest of the group, and they drove us to jail and held us in sort of a holding tank parking area outside where it was super cold, and then they took us inside for processing. They did the whole fingerprinting thing, and then they made us dress down and put on jail clothes, which consisted of an orange scrub-like outfit and flip-flop sandals that we all called Air Jerusalems. And I had to come down off of cocaine that night in jail. It was like one of the more miserable experiences of my life to that point. I was freezing cold and sitting in this concrete room with a few other guys with blue gymnastic mats stretched out across the floor to sleep on. And I attempted something like sleep, but the fluorescent lights above never went out, and so it was impossible. It was a wretched visit. 1 star. Would not recommend. The hosts were okay, but I guess. After about 24 hours, though, I reached my brother to pick me up and was charged with an MIP and some other infractions, all of which were later deferred for good behavior. The next time cops showed up at a party, though, I was determined not to let them catch me. Casey and I had gone to another house party in Puyallup close to the fairgrounds, but this time I'd learned my lesson. I was on the rear balcony holding a beer in one hand and a cigarette in the other when sirens and flashing lights arrived on the scene. I saw police move through the house from the sliding glass window, which meant I really only had a few moments to think about what to do next. So I jumped off the balcony. And to my regret, this balcony was about 3 floors high and above an enormous rolling hill. I just plummeted like a stuntman into the landscape below, and luckily my intoxicated body was limber, and I just collapsed like a puppet whose strings had been cut. And I tumbled down the hill a few hundred yards unharmed. And I remember coming to and looking way up at the house and the balcony that I'd just flown from, and all of the police flashlights were shining my way, scanning the brush and grass along where I had laid. And so I quickly pulled the sticker bushes and leaves over my body and just lay in the mud on the hillside. And flashlights moved over me again and again, scanning for any movement. And apparently, in my haste, I had just abandoned Casey above at the party, and the police were looking for me so I could drive him home. But I wasn't going to be fooled again, and I remained in the mud, irrespective of their calls, until daybreak, when I no longer saw any police cars around. Around this same time, I had switched high schools from White River High School to Sumner High School. The reason for the transfer was that I was failing out at White River and simultaneously getting into a lot of trouble with my extracurricular activities. And so my mom saw a transfer to Sumner as an opportunity to make new friends and better habits. But unfortunately, by that time, I was already pretty proficient at finding which of my peers were also engaged in the same extracurriculars. So I developed a knack for fitting in with the cool kids. And the more I partied, the more my social status seemed to grow. And so the cycle continued. I established a new peer group at Sumner pretty quickly with a couple of guys I know, Alex and Josh, who were in my weightlifting class. And they were both familiar with some associations from my peer group at the parking lot car club and through other mutual associations who worked with them at Kentucky Fried Chicken at the time. And so we were all fast friends, the lot of us, and I quickly found myself, pushing my limits even further. We were drinking more and taking wilder chances. Alex inevitably told me about a drug he had tried called ecstasy or Thiz, and how it was a fantastic fun time. And the first time I took ecstasy, I'd gone to KFC to meet up with Alex and Josh while they were closing and cleaning up the store. And we'd made plans to go to a party out by Lake Tapps where apparently other people were going to be there doing ecstasy. And so we'd downed a few tablets before leaving the store. And at that time, ecstasy was sold in these like pressed tablets or these little round capsule type shapes with a variety of different colors with a specific stamp or mark pressed into the tab that they might be a blue Louis Vuitton or a green Spider-Man. But that night they were blue Spider-Mans. And I remember waiting in KFC for something to happen. And suddenly there was like waves of euphoric rushes just kind of surging over my body. And I was just feeling this like rushed feeling like gravity had been just turned down or something. And everything suddenly felt spectacular to the touch. The handle of the door leaving the store, the fabric of the seats in my friend's car. The world was full of tactile sensations. And we rode in my friend Tom's Pontiac Fiero over to the party, and the music on the drive over just sounded incredible. We were listening to a burnt CD album of Trance Party Hits Volume 1, and I remember specifically when Toka's or I Need a Miracle by Phragma came on through the speaker. I don't think I had experienced like a more peak moment up to that point in my entire life. This is just like, whoa, this is fucking spectacular. And the music, how it felt, that the night outside, the lights of the passing cars, everything was just fucking spectacular. I don't know how else to describe it, really. I enjoyed every second of it. Once we arrived at our destination, we went inside and saw a party like I'd never seen before. Rather than the ruckus and debauchery and drunken mess-making over red cups that was atypical of the social gatherings with alcohol that I had been involved or invited to at the time, here there was this room that was dark, and folks were sitting around giving each other back rubs. And in the corner there was someone waving around glow sticks while two other people seated in front of them were kind of gazing at the lights with their heads together. And within a few minutes, I met this really beautiful girl with this frizzy curly hair named Demi. And she was rubbing my hands and kissing my neck. And I started kissing her back. And at the time, it was just the most supreme moment. I was totally captured by the experience and just swept up in the euphoria. This surely was peak living. The music, the vibes, the drugs, the sensations, it was all a softer kind of chaos. That party experience quickly turned into the Seattle rave scene, which was pretty lively at the time. I mean, really, to me, it was peak trance and club dancing and just a fun time to be alive. I would go to Seattle on the weekends with friends, and we'd go to these venues that were essentially warehouses kind of turned into trance music shows. And I would go pick up Demi and her sister Patty in Renton, and then we would drive north on 405 to I-5 until we got to Linwood to get to our friend Maddie J. Then we would head south into Seattle for a night of ecstasy and dancing at whatever rave was happening that night. We'd listen to Armin van Buuren or Tiesto on the way there, and then Postal Service Always on the way back. And at raves, I would dance, or I would sit for light shows, which was when someone would just twirl colored lights, a few inches from your face. Or you could get a sea breeze where someone would blow a Vicks vapor inhaler at your eyes to create sort of a menthol sensation. And people would also try to just get as close to the amplifiers as possible to feel the vibration. And the whole experience was focused on sensory pleasure in a way that you don't see at EDM shows in the same way today. We didn't really care about the DJ or who was performing. It was just being there and experiencing it. Demi was my crush at the time, and she was always out of reach. I would occasionally kiss her, and she would kiss me when we were both high, but sober, she was generally uninterested in me for the most part. But I thought she was spectacular, and the less interested in me that she was, the more I wanted her. I heard a saying once that said, "Never set yourself on fire to make someone else warm." And I wish I would have taken that to heart sooner. On my birthday, she invited me to pick her up, and I took her over to my house, and we watched a movie together, just me and her. And she kissed me that night and made me feel like, for a moment, I really had a chance. But that chance never manifested after that night. I was still selling weed, and the club scene was sort of an easy way to stay connected with customers. I enjoyed taking ecstasy when it was available to me. X was pretty fun to take, but the problem is the come down was no fun at all. And once you were out of pills or daylight was around, the fun inevitably had to run out. And so the come down always involved, for me, laying awake, miserable and uncomfortable, unable to turn my mind off. I would be thirsty, hot, and just jonesing for something I either didn't have or couldn't take. So inevitably, I would just take something else that was available. And if that was Coke, so be it. And after a while, Coke was kind of more fun than ecstasy. Cocaine sort of had this dangerous mystique for me. Maybe it was movies like Scarface or Blow or any other mob flick associated with the drug, but it had this sort of certain je ne sais quoi that inspired more of a gangster culture than any other drug that I'd been exposed to before. I was all Ayo for yayo at the time, and the more I did, the more my friend group started to shift a bit from the rave crowd to a bit more of a sinister group. When I would arrange buys for cocaine, it was always random. Whenever I had to meet someone, it was under suspicious circumstances and always felt like somewhere the cops would be watching, like a setup was about to happen. And probably most of that might have just been the paranoia atypical with the drug's use, but I always felt like I was putting myself in really sketchy positions when I had to buy cocaine. My stomping grounds shifted quickly from Sumner to then Puyallup, and then from Puyallup to Spanaway, and then from Spanaway to Parkland and Tacoma. And my social group generally became much more crime involved. I would routinely steal from parties, steal other people's drugs, or lie. I remember one time I betrayed my friend Alex for like $10 worth of cocaine. He had given me $10 and I had $10 and I was supposed to go buy us what would have been the 20 the 20 sack, which is generally the lowest amount a dealer would meet up with you for at the time. And after I got the bag, I just ignored Alex's calls altogether and then decided to use all of it myself. And it was like stone cold. And there was no reason for me to do it other than just my own selfish desire to have like a little bit more. But that's what Coke did to me. And it happened to all of my friends too. We all just sort of became degenerates. It was only a matter of time before I got arrested again. This time it was much more seriously humiliating though. And I think it was probably a good thing for me. We were visiting extended family at the time in Newport, Washington, which is just this little town right on the border of Washington and Idaho. I'd been using cocaine and stealing at the time, and I felt like the coolest kid in this little shithole town that I was visiting. And I'd gone with my family to Ben Franklin in Idaho that day and decided to steal a watch and a wallet to show off in front of my cousin. I was pretty sticky-fingered by this point, and I hadn't been caught, so I thought I could fool the counter girl at Ben Franklin by having her take out a bunch of display watches, and then when she wasn't looking, I would try to put one in my pocket. Well, she might not have seen me, but the security cameras sure did, and before I made it out of the store, I was detained and arrested, and then released to my mom. And we still had like 3 days of our vacation, so I had to explain to my entire extended family what happened and why the police showed up at the store. And I made up a story about how it was all this big misunderstanding and this stupid podunk hick store had me all wrong. And I had a court date and I would get my chance to tell my story there. But it wasn't my first rodeo. And, my drug use from there just continued to spiral out of control. And by the end of my senior year, I wasn't going to class at all. I was re-enrolled in White River because my bad friends there weren't as bad as my bad friends at Sumner, but none of it worked out too well. I mean, it was really all a little too little too late. I had more run-ins with the police, and my life was just well and spiraling out of control. I'd nearly been arrested on Ording-Sumner Highway after I was caught with an ounce of weed as a passenger in my brother's car. An undercover Nissan Altima, which I'd never seen before and haven't seen since, pulled us over with a sort of like visor police light and hidden grill lights. And the cop didn't even go to the driver's side, but rather went straight to my door and opened it without asking me any questions, just pulling me from the vehicle. "Where's the meth?" he says to me. And I'm like, "Man, we're just smoking weed." And he asks again, "Where's the meth?" he asks breathlessly. And I'm like, "Man, we're just smoking weed," I said back honestly, surprised. Marijuana was still very much illegal at that time, but the officer still seemed relatively relieved. That was all that we had. He had looked over this Chillum-style pipe we were smoking from and said that he had observed us smoking and believed that based on the shape of the pipe that we were smoking meth by mistake. And unfortunately I had an ounce of weed at me at the time, and he had located it, and all the other passengers in the car, as well as my brother, all claimed innocence and that I had just started smoking it out of nowhere. Assholes, I know. But they tried to later justify it, that it was so that they could bail me out, which is plausible. So, c'est la vie. But the officer ultimately just made me stomp out my weed into a puddle of mud nearby, but otherwise let me leave on my own recognizance. And so I was grateful to have avoided any potential felonies, as really at the time it only took a determined officer and a couple of misplaced baggies and a scale for a simple possession charge to elevate to intent to distribute. The next time I was in big trouble, I was driving above Wilkeson on some federal National Forest Service roads with some friends when a forest ranger stopped my vehicle. He took everyone's IDs, and one of my passengers had a warrant for his arrest out of Oregon. So we were all quickly detained, and before he searched the vehicle, he told us that if we made him look for the weed, he would take us all to jail. But if we handed it over to him, he would just give us tickets. Now, I knew he needed a warrant to search the vehicle, really. And if I challenged the search warrant in court, maybe I could have prevailed or appealed on appeal. I could have excluded some evidence during trial. But really, when you're in the middle of nowhere and you're detained by law enforcement, you're pretty powerless to what happens next. So I thought, all in all, it was a pretty fair offer on his part. I gave him over the rest of my weed, and he kept his end of the bargain. After a few weeks later, I received a federal charge for marijuana possession in the mail, and the rest was history. Meanwhile, a friend from high school had recently had back surgery and received a large prescription for Oxycontin. I offered to sell them for him so that we could both make some extra cash, and quickly I was selling them and trading them for cocaine. And so sometimes I would take Oxy, or other times I would take Coke, or sometimes both of them at any given party. And one night in particular, I remember feeling like maybe I'd taken too much of both and was getting really sick. I tried to puke it out, but my throat was all like numbed out from the cocaine I'd taken earlier, and I couldn't get my gag reflex to work. I remember just like trying to gag while my stomach was contracting and my skin felt cold and hot, and I thought I was going to die. I mean, honestly. And I really did almost die. I think it was probably the closest I'd come to passing in and out of this world up to that point. And after trembling for some time, I was able to kind of pull myself back together and return to the party. And I knew I was killing myself, but I just didn't want to come down or stop. So I kept it up for days on end. We would drive around from crash pad to crash pad, snorting up whatever cocaine had been, we had before, and then heading out to drive around and listen to rap music. And then we would do it all over again. And one time I even pierced my dick at a party after taking Xanax bars, amongst other things. The guys whose house we were at had several piercings himself. And he told me that his girlfriend could give me that specific piercing if I wanted it. And so armed with the safety pin and some knowledge, we went into the bathroom and she stretched out my willy and gave me a piercing just about halfway up the skin on the shaft. And I kept the safety pin in for a couple days, but I quickly realized that it was going to have to be replaced with an actual barbell, like jewelry from the body jewelry store. And the problem with that is that those have like a way bigger gauge than the safety pin. And I remember trying to put it in myself in the shower and failing. So I went to my gay friend Ryan's house and convinced his friend Kate to give me a hand. And I remember her trying to put the ring in, and then next thing you know, I just like woke up on the floor in a daze with my pants down. I'd fainted for all our efforts, but it was a success. And I would just, after that, I would show off my dick to pretty much anyone who asked to see it for weeks to come. I was always, chasing the next big rush at that time, the next big high. I remember we'd traveled to Portland because a friend of mine, Kira's brother, was a DJ at the time. And so we went to a show at this venue called the Heartbreak House or something like that. Anyways, it was this really cool venue with a few floors of music. And then it had this like indoor and outdoor dance area. And in the outdoor section, I had met this like ex-special forces guy. He was like a Green Beret or something like that. And he told me about how when you're tripping out, that getting knocked unconscious can give you like a crazy rush. And he could just make me pass out right then and there if I wanted to try it. So I said, sure. And he just squeezed the arteries along my neck until I passed out. And I remember waking up on the dance floor outside with like several people hovering over me, and I was way higher than I was moments before, and it was like a rush. So I did it a few more times after and after. And then I went back inside to dance the rest of the night. And later we went to a local house to listen to ATV and come down. And that was just like another Saturday night for me. Later that month, I got the idea that I needed a gun for protection. And so I started shopping around with my friend Paul T. We had a connection to a guy in Tacoma through our other mutual friend, David. Paul picked us up in his little red Ford Focus sedan, and we drove out to this place over by 72nd to pick up a guy who was supposed to take us to another guy who sold the guns. And when we got there, this dude was shit-faced. I mean, drunk out of his mind on some like MD 2020, and was like telling us about how the FBI had been watching him for weeks. And he pointed out his window to show us this white contractor van parked across the street and said it had been there for days, casing him out. And I was like pretty freaked out, but I didn't know for sure if he was just like drunk and full of shit or if his concerns were legit. But he told us to give him a ride anyways, and he would set us up with what we were looking for. So we set out in this red Ford Focus, and I'm in the back seat with this guy. And remember, I'm high on coke, and we're all going to buy this handgun. And man, I got to say, it all felt pretty wrong. The vibes were bad. Suddenly, this guy starts puking all over the back seat of the car, and it's like staining Paul's tan cloth seats in this vibrant Kool-Aid red colored vomit. And he manages, to bring himself under control long enough to point to us to pull over at this house 2 blocks up. We park, and he goes inside, and he comes back out saying he has a revolver for $500 and it's clean. And clean at the time meant that it hadn't been used in some murder or other crime. And before I could agree, these 2 state patrol cars like pulled up and across the street and just parked. And suddenly it all felt like it was a setup, or we were there about to get busted. And so I yelled to Paul to just screw the deal and drive. And so he takes off before we could finish the transaction, and everybody's pissed. And pissed at me because they think I blew this good deal that they worked all hard to set up and everything. But I just knew that something was going to happen. And so we got out of Dodge. And, everything had just spiraled well and out of control. I hadn't even graduated high school yet. And well, to be fair, I didn't have much of a chance at graduating high school without another year of classes to try to make up for all my credit shortfalls. I was facing criminal consequences for my theft charge in Idaho, and my mom offered to drive me to rehab if I was willing to go after secretly testing some pee that I had left unflushed in a toilet at home. And at the time, I think I was kind of begging for an exit, even if I wouldn't admit it. I had a sense that it was only a matter of time before, I was killed or had an overdose or landed myself in prison. Things hadn't been fun for a long time. And so I notified my teachers that I wouldn't be coming back to class for the remainder of the year. I gave my yearbook to my good friend Kristen, who promised to have my other friends sign it for me, and then I packed my bags and headed off overnight to Sundown M Ranch in Yakima for a 28-day stay in their juvenile rehabilitation facility. All right, thanks for listening to Odyssey of a Teenage Dirtbag. Every episode is another piece of the story, proof that no matter how far you fall, there's always a way back up. If this episode meant something to you, share it with someone who needs to hear it. Until next time, keep chasing the life you were meant to live.